Jake Mitchell hadn't felt a woman's touch in 23 years. Living alone on his mountain ranch with only cattle for company, he'd forgotten how to talk to people. Then Sarah drove up his dusty road with one simple request: "Can I see your cows?" Everything changed. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The morning sun painted the mountains gold as Jake Mitchell walked across his ranch, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. At 58, his face was weathered like old leather, marked by decades of sun and wind. His hands were rough and scarred from years of ranch work, and his heart, well, his heart had been locked away for so long he'd almost forgotten it was there. 23 years. That's how long it had been since he'd held a woman's hand, since he'd felt the warmth of someone who cared. 23 years since Margaret died in that car accident, leaving him alone on this 1,000-acre ranch with nothing but memories and cattle for company. Jake preferred it that way. People were complicated. Cattle were simple. You fed them, cared for them, and they didn't break your heart or leave you staring at empty coffee cups in the morning. The nearest town was Millfield, population 847, and Jake only went there when he absolutely had to, for supplies, the bank, or the occasional doctor visit. Even then he kept his head down, spoke only when spoken to, and got out as fast as possible. The townspeople had long since stopped trying to include him in their gatherings. Jake Mitchell was the hermit rancher who lived up on Cedar Ridge, and that was fine by everyone. His daily routine never changed. Up at 5 a.m., check the cattle, mend fences, tend to the horses, eat a simple meal, and go to bed by 9 p.m. He had 3 dogs, Rex, Blue, and Daisy, and they were all the company he needed. Or so he told himself every single day. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Jake was fixing a broken gate post when he heard the sound of a car engine struggling up his dirt road. His stomach tightened. Nobody came up here. Ever. His ranch was at the end of a dead-end road, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor. Through the morning haze, he saw a small red sedan bouncing over the ruts and potholes. Jake's first instinct was to grab his rifle and wait on the porch, but something made him stay by the gate. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the way the car moved so carefully, like whoever was driving didn't want to damage anything. The car pulled up near his house and stopped. Jake watched as the driver's door opened and out stepped a woman. She was probably in her early 40s, with shoulder-length brown hair that caught the sunlight. She wore simple jeans, boots, and a blue flannel shirt. Nothing fancy. But there was something about the way she moved, confident but respectful, that made Jake's chest feel tight. She saw him by the gate and walked over, her steps careful but determined. As she got closer, Jake noticed her eyes were green, the color of spring grass after rain. When was the last time he'd really looked at someone's eyes? "Excuse me," she called out when she was still 20 feet away. Her voice was soft but clear. "Are you Jake Mitchell?" Jake's throat felt dry. He nodded, not trusting his voice. "I'm Sarah Chen," she said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard you have the most beautiful cattle in the county. I was wondering, would it be possible to see them?" Jake stared at her. In 23 years of isolation, nobody had ever asked to see his cows. People asked to buy them, sure. The bank had asked about them during hard years. But nobody had ever called them beautiful. "I know it's a strange request," Sarah continued, misreading his silence. "I'm a photographer. I specialize in rural life, farm animals. I've been driving around this area for weeks, and everyone in town says your Highland cattle are something special." Highland cattle. Jake's pride and joy. He'd started with just 2 cows and a bull 30 years ago, and now he had over 60 of the shaggy, longhorn beauties. Margaret had always loved them too. She'd named the first calf Annie, and Jake still had Annie's great-granddaughter in his herd. "They're just cows," Jake finally managed to say, his voice rustier than an old gate hinge. Sarah smiled and something cracked open inside Jake's chest. "I doubt that. The way Mr. Henderson at the feed store talks about them, they're practically works of art." Old Henderson had been talking about his cattle? Jake felt a strange warmth in his cheeks. "I could pay you," Sarah added quickly, "for your time. I know you're busy." Jake shook his head. The idea of taking money from this woman felt wrong somehow. "No need for that. I guess you can see them. They're in the north pasture." Sarah's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? Thank you so much. I promise I won't be any trouble." Jake found himself walking beside her toward the pasture, acutely aware of her presence. She smelled like vanilla and something else he couldn't identify. Sunshine maybe. When was the last time he'd walked anywhere with someone? "How long have you had Highland cattle?" Sarah asked as they walked. About 30 years, Jake replied. Then, surprising himself, he added, my wife, she picked out the first ones. Said they looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. Your wife has good taste, Sarah said. Are they friendly? She passed. 23 years ago. The words came out before Jake could stop them. He never talked about Margaret. Ever. Sarah stopped walking. I'm so sorry. That must have been incredibly hard. Jake expected her to change the subject quickly, the way most people did when death came up. Instead, she just waited, like she understood that sometimes grief needed a moment to breathe. It was, Jake said simply. They reached the north pasture and Sarah gasped. Spread across the green meadow were Jake's Highland cattle, magnificent creatures with long shaggy coats in shades of red, black, and cream. Their distinctive long horns caught the morning light, and their calm, intelligent eyes watched the newcomers with interest. Oh my God, Sarah whispered. They're incredible. Look at that red one, she's gorgeous. That's Rosie, Jake said, and again he surprised himself by continuing. She's Annie's great-granddaughter. Annie was our first calf. Sarah pulled a camera from her bag and started taking pictures, but Jake noticed she was careful not to startle the animals. She moved slowly, respectfully, and the cattle seemed to sense her gentle nature. Soon, several of them had wandered closer to the fence. They're curious about you, Jake observed. Animals usually like me, Sarah said, reaching through the fence to stroke Rosie's nose. The cow accepted the attention peacefully. I grew up on a small farm in Oregon. We had dairy cows, but nothing as beautiful as these. For the next hour, Jake found himself doing something he hadn't done in decades, talking. Really talking. He told Sarah about each cow, their personalities, their lineage. He explained how Highland cattle were perfect for this climate, how their long coats protected them in winter, how intelligent and gentle they were. Sarah listened to every word, asked thoughtful questions, and took dozens of photos. She laughed when Jake told her about Buster, the bull who was afraid of butterflies. She got tears in her eyes when he mentioned Old Belle, who had died the previous winter at the age of 18. You really love them, Sarah said as they leaned against the fence, watching the herd graze in the afternoon sun. They're good company, Jake replied. Then after a long pause, better than most people. Have you been alone all this time? Since your wife died. The question should have felt invasive, but somehow it didn't. Yeah, easier that way. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Easier maybe. But not better. Jake looked at her sharply, ready to be defensive, but her expression was kind, not judgmental. You don't know anything about it. You're right, Sarah said. I don't. But I know something about being alone. I was married for 15 years. When it ended 2 years ago, I thought I wanted to be alone forever too. What changed your mind? Sarah smiled sadly. I realized there's a difference between choosing solitude and letting fear choose it for you. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the cattle. Jake felt something stirring in his chest that he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. Connection. The simple pleasure of sharing something you loved with someone who appreciated it. Would you like some coffee? Jake heard himself ask. It's not fancy, but it's hot. Sarah's face brightened. I'd love some. Jake's kitchen was simple and clean, with a small table by the window that looked out over the south pasture. He'd eaten alone at that table for 23 years, and now suddenly there was someone sitting across from him, warming her hands around a blue ceramic mug. This is nice, Sarah said, looking around. Peaceful. It's quiet, Jake agreed. Quiet can be good. The city where I live now, it's always noisy. Sometimes I miss the sound of silence. Where do you live? Denver. I moved there after the divorce. Thought I needed a fresh start in a big place. Sarah sipped her coffee. Turns out what I really needed was to remember who I was before everything got complicated. Hence the cattle photography? Sarah laughed. Hence the cattle photography, and the small towns. And the long drives through beautiful country. I'm trying to find my way back to simple things. Things that matter. Jake understood that more than he cared to admit. What did you do before? I was a corporate photographer. Headshots, company events, product catalogs. Good money, but... She shrugged. It didn't feed my soul, you know? Now I'm trying to capture the real America. The parts people don't see anymore. Like Highland cattle in the middle of nowhere. Exactly. Like a man who's created something beautiful and meaningful, even if nobody else sees it. Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks again. I just raise cattle. You do more than that. Those animals are healthy and happy. This land is well cared for. You've preserved something important here. Sarah leaned forward slightly. That matters, Jake. Nobody had said his name like that in years. Like it meant something. They talked until the sun started to set. Sarah told him about her travels, the interesting people she'd met, the small towns that were dying and the ones that were finding new life. Jake found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone, about Margaret, about the early days of the ranch, about the hard years when he'd almost lost everything. I should probably head back to town, Sarah finally said, glancing at the darkening sky. Thank you for this. For showing me the cattle, for the coffee, for talking with me. Jake's chest tightened at the thought of her leaving. You could stay, he heard himself say. Then realizing how that sounded, he quickly added, I mean there's a guest room. It's a long drive back to town in the dark and these mountain roads. Sarah studied his face for a long moment. Are you sure? I don't want to impose. You're not imposing. And surprisingly, Jake meant it. The guest room had been Margaret's sewing room before she died. Jake had kept it clean but hadn't changed anything. Sarah seemed to understand the significance without being told. She must have been a lovely person, Sarah said softly, looking at the quilt on the bed. She was. Jake cleared his throat. Bathrooms down the hall. There are fresh towels in the closet. Jake. Sarah called as he turned to leave. Yeah. Thank you. This has been one of the best days I've had in a long time. Jake nodded, not trusting his voice, and went to his own room. But he didn't sleep. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of someone else in his house. The creak of floorboards, the sound of water running, the gentle closing of a door. Sounds he'd forgotten he missed. Morning came too soon. Jake was up early as always, but instead of his usual routine, he found himself making a real breakfast: eggs, bacon, toast, fresh coffee. When Sarah appeared in the kitchen, her hair still damp from a shower, Jake felt that strange tightness in his chest again. Something smells wonderful, she said. Figured you might be hungry. Jake set a plate in front of her, their fingers brushing briefly as she took it. The contact sent electricity up his arm. After breakfast, Sarah went back to the pasture to take more photos. Jake watched her work, admiring her patience and skill. She waited for the perfect moments, Rosie nuzzling her calf, Buster standing majestically against the mountain backdrop, the whole herd moving together like a living painting. These are going to be beautiful, Sarah said, showing Jake some of the pictures on her camera. Would it be okay if I used them in my portfolio? Maybe submitted them to some magazines? You'd put my cattle in magazines? If that's okay with you. I think people would love to see them. Jake felt a pride he hadn't experienced in years. Yeah, that'd be fine. They spent the morning together, and Jake found himself wishing it would never end. But eventually, Sarah packed up her camera and walked back to her car. I should probably get going, she said, but she didn't move toward the driver's door. Long drive back to Denver, Jake agreed, also not moving. They stood there for a moment, neither wanting to be the first to say goodbye. Jake, Sarah said finally, would it be okay if I came back sometime? I mean to take more pictures. The lighting is different at different times of day, and I'd love to capture the cattle in different seasons. Jake's heart jumped. You'd want to come back. If you wouldn't mind the company. I wouldn't mind. Sarah smiled. Good. Because I have a confession. I didn't really drive up here just for the cattle. Jake's eyebrows rose. No. Well, not entirely. Mr. Henderson mentioned your cattle, yes. But he also said you were the loneliest man he'd ever known. Said it was a shame because you were a good man who just had his heart broken too badly to heal. Sarah's cheeks turned pink. I know it sounds crazy, but something about that made me want to meet you. Jake stared at her. You came here because you heard I was lonely? I came here because I recognized something in that description. Because I've been lonely too, and I thought maybe we could be less lonely together. For a moment, Jake couldn't breathe. 23 years of isolation had made him forget that connection was possible. That someone might see past his rough exterior and want to know the man underneath. Sarah, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. Is it okay that I came here for you, Jake? Not just the cows. Instead of answering, Jake did something he hadn't done in over 2 decades. He reached out and gently touched her face, his rough fingers tracing the line of her cheek. Sarah leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly. I haven't. Jake started, then stopped. It's been so long since. I know, Sarah whispered. For me too. They stood there in the morning sunshine, 2 people who had been alone too long, finally finding each other. Jake's hand was still on her face, and Sarah's hand came up to cover it. When will you come back? Jake asked. How about next weekend? That's too long. Sarah laughed, a sound like music. How about Wednesday? Better. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek, a gentle brush of lips that sent warmth through his entire body. Wednesday then. Jake watched her drive away, but for the first time in 23 years, he wasn't watching someone leave forever. He was watching someone leave who was coming back. That evening, as he did his rounds checking the cattle, Jake found himself talking to them more than usual. Well, Rosie, he said to the red cow, looks like we might have some regular company around here. What do you think about that? Rosie looked at him with her intelligent brown eyes and made a soft lowing sound that Jake chose to interpret as approval. Over the next few months, Sarah kept her promise. She came every Wednesday and then Wednesdays and Saturdays, and eventually she was spending more time at the ranch than in Denver. She brought her photography equipment, but she also brought laughter and stories and a warmth that had been missing from Jake's life for so long. She helped with the cattle, learned their names and personalities. She cooked meals that filled the house with wonderful smells. She sat with Jake on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, content in comfortable silence or deep conversation. And slowly, carefully, Jake's heart began to heal. The first time Sarah stayed a full week, Jake woke up in the middle of the night in a panic. What if she left? What if this was all temporary? What if he was setting himself up for the same devastating loss he'd experienced with Margaret? Sarah found him sitting on the porch at 3 a.m., staring out at the dark pastures. Hey, she said softly, sitting beside him. What's wrong? I'm scared, Jake admitted, the words coming out in a rush. I'm scared you'll leave. I'm scared I'll lose you like I lost her. I'm scared I'm too old, too set in my ways, too broken to be what you need. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she took his hand, lacing their fingers together. Jake, I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise you this. I'm not here because I'm looking for someone to fix or someone to save. I'm here because when I'm with you, I'm the best version of myself. You make me feel peaceful and grounded and found. But you have a whole life in Denver. Your work, your apartment. My apartment is just a place to sleep. My work can be done anywhere. In fact, it's better when I'm happy. And my life. Sarah squeezed his hand. My real life started the day I asked to see your cows. 6 months later, Sarah officially moved to the ranch. She converted the old barn loft into a photography studio and darkroom, and her pictures of Highland cattle, particularly Jake's Highland cattle, started appearing in magazines and art galleries across the country. People began making the trek up to Cedar Ridge Ranch, not just to see the famous cattle but to meet the man who raised them and the woman who captured their beauty. Jake, who had been a hermit for over 2 decades, found himself giving tours and sharing stories, Sarah always by his side to smooth the way when his social skills got rusty. You know what's funny? Sarah said one evening as they watched a group of visitors head back to their cars, their faces bright with the joy of having met the Highland cattle. What? You spent all those years thinking you were alone with just your cows for company. But you were never really alone. You were taking care of something beautiful, preserving something important. You were connected to the land, to the animals, to something bigger than yourself. Jake considered this. But it was lonely. Yes, it was lonely. But it wasn't empty. And that's why, when I showed up asking to see your cows, you had something beautiful to share. Sarah leaned against his shoulder. You were ready for love, Jake. You just didn't know it. A year after Sarah first drove up that dusty road, Jake asked her to marry him. He did it simply, without fanfare, on a Wednesday evening as they watched Rosie's new calf take its first wobbly steps. Sarah, he said, would you like to stay forever? She looked at him, her green eyes sparkling with tears and laughter. Are you asking me to marry you, Jake Mitchell? I guess I am. Not very romantic, is it? Sarah kissed him, long and sweet, while the Highland cattle grazed peacefully around them and the mountains turned purple in the evening light. It's perfect, she whispered against his lips. Just like you. They were married the following spring in the north pasture, surrounded by family, friends, and 63 Highland cattle who served as the most unusual wedding party in the county's history. Old Henderson from the feed store walked Sarah down the aisle, tears streaming down his weathered face. I knew that woman was exactly what you needed, he told Jake afterward. Minute she walked into my store asking about your cattle, I knew she was different. How? Henderson grinned. Because she didn't ask how much they were worth. She asked how beautiful they were. That's when I knew she was the one. As Jake and Sarah danced their first dance as husband and wife, with string lights twinkling overhead and the cattle watching curiously from beyond the fence, Jake marveled at how his life had changed. 23 years of solitude, ended by a woman who asked to see his cows. What are you thinking about? Sarah asked, her head on his shoulder. Just wondering what would have happened if you'd been interested in chickens instead of cattle. Sarah laughed. Well, then I guess I would have ended up with some lonely chicken farmer instead of the love of my life. Lucky me you liked cows. Lucky both of us. They swayed together under the stars, surrounded by the people and animals they loved, in the place that had become their sanctuary. Jake's rough hands, which had known only work and loss for so long, now knew tenderness again. His heart, which had been locked away in grief, was full of hope and joy and the kind of deep, abiding love that only comes once in a lifetime, if you're very, very lucky. And in the pasture beyond, Rosie and her family grazed peacefully, the Highland cattle who had brought two lonely souls together, continuing their quiet work of making the world a little more beautiful, one day at a time. This story explores themes of loss, healing, and the unexpected ways love can find us. Sometimes the most profound connections come from the simplest encounters, like a stranger asking to see your cows. Jake's journey from isolation to love reminds us that it's never too late to open our hearts again, and that sometimes the most beautiful things in our lives are the ones we've been tending quietly, waiting for someone who will see their true value.